Princess Kayla walked through the corridors of her massive warship, and her footsteps echoed against the dark metal walls, and behind her floated two young dragons, who followed her everywhere she went, and their names were Ash and Ember, and they were barely 5 years old, but already their scales shimmered with power and their eyes glowed with ancient intelligence that most creatures would never possess in their entire lifetimes. The ship was called the Crimson Dawn, and it carried 3,000 soldiers and 200 attack vessels, and it was the pride of the Elvari Empire, and Kayla had commanded it since her 200th birthday, and in the 50 years since then she had conquered 17 star systems and brought them, all under her father's rule. And she had never lost a single battle, and her reputation spread across the galaxy like wildfire. She stopped at the observation deck and looked out at the blue and green planet spinning slowly below. And this was Earth, and it was the home world of the humans, and they were a young species who had only reached the stars 200 years ago, and they were weak and soft, and they had rejected every offer of peaceful submission that her father had sent. And now they would learn what happened to those who defied the Elvari Empire. Ash nuzzled against her shoulder and made a soft chirping sound, and Kayla reached up to scratch behind his horns, and he was black as midnight with eyes like burning coals, and Ember was his sister, and she was the color of fire with silver markings along her wings, and together they were bonded to Kayla through ancient magic that tied their souls together, and they would die for her without hesitation. The door opened behind. Her and Commander Vex entered the observation deck, and he was her second in command, and he had served under her father before being assigned to her ship, and he bowed low before speaking and said, "Princess, the human fleet has gathered near their moon, and they have 40 ships, and they are requesting one final negotiation before hostilities begin." Kayla turned away from the window, and her long silver hair flowed behind her like liquid starlight, and her eyes were the color of amethyst, and she wore armor made from dragon scales that had been shed by the ancient ones, and it was black and purple, and it made her look like a goddess of war, and she smiled, but there was no warmth in it, and she said, "Tell them I will accept their negotiation, but only if their champion meets me in single combat, and if I win, they surrender their planet without resistance, and if they win, we leave their system forever." Vex hesitated and said, "Princess, the humans are known for their unpredictability, and they do not follow the old codes of honor, and they may attempt deception." Kayla laughed, and it was a sound like crystal breaking, and she said, "Then they will die like cowards, and either way, this planet will be ours by tomorrow, and send the message." Commander Vex bowed again and left the observation deck, and Kayla returned her gaze to the planet below, and Ember flew up to eye level and stared at her bonded partner, and Kayla could feel the dragon's emotions through their connection. And Ember was excited and eager for battle, and Ash was more cautious, but he too wanted to prove himself. And Kayla sent waves of confidence through the bond and whispered, "You will both taste victory soon, my children." 2 hours later the reply came, and the humans had accepted her terms, and their champion would meet her on the surface of their moon, and the location was an old mining facility that had been abandoned 30 years ago, and it was neutral ground, and both sides would send observers. But no weapons except what the combatants carried themselves. Kayla prepared for the battle by meditating in her private chambers, and she sat cross-legged on the floor, and Ash and Ember curled around her, and she reached deep into the well of power that existed in every Elvari warrior, and she felt it respond and flow through her veins like liquid fire. And her people had evolved over millions of years, and they were stronger and faster and more intelligent than almost any species in the galaxy, and the humans by comparison were children playing with toys they did not understand. She dressed in light armor that would allow maximum movement, and she chose her blade, which had been forged by the master smiths of her homeworld, and it was made from star metal and enchanted with runes that made it nearly indestructible, and the edge could cut through almost anything, and she had used it to kill hundreds of enemies, and it had never failed her. The transport ship carried her down to the moons. Surface and Vex accompanied her along with 10 honor guards, and when they landed, she could see the human delegation waiting near the entrance to the mining facility, and there were 20 of them, and they wore simple military uniforms, and they looked small and fragile compared to her warriors. The human champion stepped forward, and he was tall for his species, and he had dark hair and brown eyes, and he wore minimal armor and carried only a simple rifle and a combat knife, and his name was Jake Miller, and he was a captain in the Earth Defense Force, and he had fought in the border wars against the Zarathi raiders, and he had a reputation among his people as someone who never gave up. Kayla walked toward him, and ash and ember flew above her head, and the dragons cast long shadows across the gray lunar dust, and she stopped 10 paces away from the human and said, "I am Princess Kayla of the Elvari Empire and daughter of Emperor Theron, and I have conquered 17 systems and killed 10,000 warriors in single combat, and you are brave to face me, human, but bravery will not save you today." Jake Miller looked at her and then at the dragons and then back at her, and he said, "I am Captain Jake Miller, and I fight for Earth and for humanity, and I don't care how many systems you have conquered or how many warriors you have killed, and all that matters is what happens here and now." Kayla felt a flicker of respect for the human, and he did not show fear. And he did not beg for mercy, and he simply stood ready to fight. And she drew her blade, and the metal sang as it left the scabbard, and she said, "Then let us begin, human, and may your death be swift." The observers from both sides moved back to give them space, and the battlefield was a flat area of lunar rock about 50 meters across, and there was no atmosphere. So they both wore helmets with air supplies, and the gravity was low, which would make movement interesting. And Kayla had fought in low gravity before, but she did not know if the human had the same experience. Jake raised his rifle and fired 3 quick shots, and Kayla moved with speed that seemed impossible, and she dodged the first 2 bullets and deflected the third with her blade, and she closed the distance between them in seconds and swung her sword in a wide arc that would have cut him in half. But Jake threw himself backward and rolled away and came up firing again. The fight continued for 20 minutes, and Kayla began to realize that the human was better than she expected, and he used the low gravity to his advantage, and he moved in ways that were unconventional and unpredictable, and he was not trying to match her strength. Instead, he was trying to tire her out and wear her down, and it was a smart strategy, but it would not work, because her stamina was far greater than his. Ash and Ember watched from above, and they wanted to help their bonded partner, but the rules of single combat forbade it, and they circled overhead and made angry sounds that echoed across the silent moon. Kayla pressed her attack, and she was faster and stronger and more skilled, and slowly she began to land hits, and her blade cut through Jake's armor and left shallow wounds on his arms and legs, and he was bleeding and slowing down, and she could see the exhaustion in his movements. Jake made one final desperate move, and he charged at her and fired his rifle at point-blank range, but Kayla sidestepped and brought her blade up in a perfect thrust, and the star metal pierced through his chest armor and through his ribs and into his heart, and she felt the resistance of flesh and bone. And then, nothing. As the blade emerged from his back, Jake looked down at the sword sticking through his chest and then up at Kayla, and his eyes were wide with shock, and he dropped his rifle and grabbed the blade with both hands, and blood poured from the wound and from his mouth behind his helmet visor, and Kayla pulled the sword free, and Jake stumbled backward toward the edge of a deep mining shaft that was filled with ice water from the moon's underground ocean. He fell, and Kayla watched as he tumbled into the darkness, and she heard the splash as his body hit the water far below, and the ice would freeze him and the pressure would crush him, and there was no way he could survive, and she turned away and raised her bloody sword above her head and said, "The human champion is dead, and Earth belongs to the Elvari Empire." Human observers stood frozen in shock, and the Elvari warriors cheered, and Ash and Ember dove down and landed on Kayla's shoulders, and she walked back to her transport ship and did not look back at the mining shaft, and she felt satisfied that another victory had been won and another world had fallen to her. Might Commander Vex greeted her at the ship and said, "Princess, the human forces are requesting time to retrieve their champions." Body Kayla removed her helmet, and her face was splattered with blood, and she said no, and let him stay in the ice as a reminder of what happens to those who challenge the Elvari, and order the fleet to move into position around Earth and begin landing operations immediately. Within hours, Elvari ships descended on every major city and military base, and the human resistance crumbled quickly, and within 3 days Earth had formally surrendered, and Kayla stood in the United Nations building and accepted the surrender documents and SH. Jake Miller opened his eyes and saw only darkness, and cold water surrounded him, and his chest burned with pain that felt like fire spreading through every nerve, and he could not breathe, and his lungs screamed for air, and he kicked upward, but he did not know which way was up, and the water pressed against him from all sides, and he was dying. His hand touched something solid and smooth, and it was not ice or rock, and it felt warm despite the freezing water, and suddenly light exploded around him, and it was blue and bright, and it hurt his eyes, and the warmth spread from his hand up his arm and into his chest where the sword had pierced him, and the pain changed from burning to tingling, and then to something else entirely. The water around him began to glow, and symbols appeared in the light, and they were not human writing, and they were not Elvery either. And they were something far older, and they swirled around his body like living things, and he felt them enter his wounds and his lungs and his blood, and he should have been terrified, but instead he felt calm and peaceful and safe. A voice spoke in his mind, and it was not words exactly, but he understood it anyway, and it said, "You are dying human, and you should be dead already. But you touch the ancient gate, and the gate has chosen you, and you will be remade, and you will become something more than what you were. And do you accept this gift?" Jake tried to speak, but water filled his mouth, and he could not make sounds, so he thought his answer as loudly as he could, and he thought yes because he did not want to die. And he had a mission, and his people needed him, and he would accept any price to have the chance to stop the Elvari Empire. The voice said, "Then it is done, and welcome, child of Earth, to the next stage of your evolution." The light grew brighter until Jake could see nothing else, and the pain in his chest vanished, and his wounds began to close, and he felt his bones knit together, and his torn muscles reform, and something was changing deep inside him at a level he could not comprehend, and his DNA was being rewritten, and new structures were forming in his cells, and his body was becoming a vessel for technology that had existed before humans had even learned to make fire. He did not know how long the transformation took, and time seemed to stop having meaning, and when the light finally faded, he was lying on a metal floor in a chamber that was not the mining shaft, and the walls were covered in the same symbols he had seen in the water, and they pulsed with soft blue light, and he was breathing air, and he was alive. Jake sat up slowly and looked down at his chest, and his armor was torn and bloody, but beneath it, his skin was whole and unbroken, and there were scars where the blade had entered and exited, and they glowed with the same blue light as the symbols on the walls, and he touched them, and felt warmth and power flowing through them. He stood and tested his legs, and they felt strong and steady, and he felt better than he had ever felt in his entire life, and his senses were sharper, and he could hear sounds that should have been too quiet to detect, and he could see details in the dim light that should have been invisible, and he felt energy flowing through his body like electricity. The chamber had one door, and it opened as he approached, and beyond it was a corridor that led upward, and Jake followed it and climbed for what felt like hours, and eventually he emerged into the abandoned mining facility, and he was back on the surface of the moon, and he could see Earth hanging in the black sky, and it looked different somehow, and he realized that more time had passed than he thought. He found a terminal in the facility and powered it up and checked the date, and his heart sank because 3 years had passed since the battle, and 3 years since he had fallen into the shaft, and 3 years since Kayla had defeated him and taken Earth. Jake accessed the news feeds and learned what had happened in his absence, and Earth was now occupied by Elvari forces, and humanity had been enslaved, and their resources were being stripped away and sent to fuel the Empire's expansion, and the resistance movements were small and scattered and mostly ineffective. He also learned that Princess Kayla had continued her campaign, and she had conquered 4 more systems since Earth, and she was now considered one of the greatest military commanders in Elvari history, and her dragons had grown to full size and were feared across the galaxy. Jake felt rage building inside him, and it was cold and focused, and he had failed his mission and failed his people, and he had let the Elvari win, but he was alive, and he had been changed, and he had been given power, and he would use it to make things right. He explored the facility and found a small ship in the hangar, and it was old but functional, and he powered it up and plotted a course away from the moon, and he needed to find out what he had become and what he could do, and then he would start his war against the Crimson Princess. The ship left the moon, and Jake set course for the asteroid belt, where he knew there were hidden human outposts and rebel bases, and As he flew, he experimented with his new abilities, and he found that he could interface directly with the ship's computer, and he did not need to use the controls, and he could simply think commands and the ship would respond. His reaction time was faster than it should be, and he could process information at speeds that seemed impossible, and he could see patterns in data that would have taken hours to analyze before. And when he looked at his reflection in the cockpit glass, he saw that his eyes glowed faintly blue, and the scars on his chest pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. He reached the first outpost, and it was a small station built into an asteroid, and he docked and entered, and the rebels there were suspicious of him until he identified himself and told them his story, and they did not believe him at first because everyone thought Captain Jake Miller had died 3 years ago. The rebel leader was a woman named Lisa Chang, and she had been a colonel in the Earth Defense Force, and she had refused to surrender when the Elvari invaded, and she had been fighting a guerrilla war ever since. And she looked at Jake with hard eyes and said, "If you are really Jake Miller, then prove it, and tell me something only he would." No, Jake told her about the last mission they had flown together before the Elvari arrived, and he described details that no one else could know. And Lisa finally accepted that he was who he claimed to be, and she embraced him and said, "We thought you were dead, and we held a memorial service for you, and your sacrifice inspired thousands to join the resistance." Jake told her about the ancient gate and the transformation and what he had become, and Lisa listened carefully and then said, "We have heard legends about technology left behind by the precursors, and they were a race that existed millions of years ago, and they built gates between star systems, and they had power beyond imagining. And if you are bonded to their technology, then you might be the weapon we need to fight back." Over the following weeks, Jake trained with his new abilities, and he learned that he could move faster than normal humans, and his strength had increased dramatically, and he could heal from injuries that would have killed him before. And most importantly, he had become invisible to most scanning technology, and the Elvari sensors could not detect him. He also discovered that he could disrupt electronic systems with his touch, and he could hack into computer networks just by being near them, and he could interface with any machine that used electricity and bend it to his will, and these abilities made him the perfect infiltrator. And saboteur Lisa helped him plan his first mission. And they targeted an Elvari supply depot on Mars, and Jake went alone, and he infiltrated the base by simply walking past the guards, because their sensors did not register his presence, and he moved through the facility like a ghost and planted charges on the ammunition stores and the fuel reserves, and then he left the same way he came. The explosion destroyed the entire depot and killed 300 Elvari soldiers, and it was the most successful resistance attack in 3 years, and the Elvari command was baffled because they could not figure out how it had happened, and their security footage showed nothing, and their sensors had detected nothing. Jake continued his campaign, and he hit target after target, and supply lines were severed, and outposts were destroyed, and Elvari soldiers began to fear the invisible enemy who struck without warning and vanished without trace, and the humans began to call him the Ghost, and hope spread through the resistance that maybe they could win. After all, Princess Kaela heard the reports, and at first she dismissed them as the desperate actions of a dying resistance, but as the attacks continued and grew bolder, she began to pay attention, and she sent investigators to examine the destroyed bases, and they found strange energy signatures that they could not explain, and the signatures matched nothing in their database. She was aboard the Crimson Dawn, preparing for the invasion of another system, when Commander Vex brought her urgent news, and he said, "Princess, there has been another attack, and this time it was on Gamma Station, and the attacker killed 300 of our elite guards and destroyed our main weapons facility, and we have no idea how they got in or how they escaped." Kayla stood, and Ash and Ember, who were now fully grown and massive, raised their heads and sensed her anger, and she said, "How is this possible? And we have the best security in the galaxy, and our sensors can detect a mouse moving in a dark room, and yet this ghost walks through our bases like they do not exist." Princess Kayla sat alone in her private chambers, and the revelation that Jake Miller had survived weighed on her mind like a physical burden. And Ash and Ember lay curled on either side of her, and they could sense her troubled thoughts through their bond, and they made soft, worried sounds that echoed in the quiet room. She had killed hundreds of enemies over her 250 years of life, and she had never given their deaths a second thought because that was the way of war, and warriors died and the strong survived, and she was strong, and that was all that mattered. But something about Jake Miller was different, and his refusal to stay dead bothered her in ways she could not explain. Commander Vex had advised increasing security and pulling back forces to better defend their core territories, but Kayla refused because retreat was not in her nature, and she would not show weakness even against an enemy she could not see. And instead she decided to set a trap. She announced publicly that she would personally oversee the mining operations on Vertex Prime, and it was a resource-rich world on the edge of Elvari space. And the announcement was broadcast across all channels, and she made sure the human resistance would hear it. And she knew that Jake Miller would come because revenge burned in him just as surely as it would burn in her if their positions were reversed. Vertex Prime was a cold world with 3 small moons and vast underground caverns filled with rare crystals that were essential for Elvari technology. And Kayla arrived with the Crimson Dawn and 5,000 elite soldiers, and she had Ash and Ember with her, and she had set up sensor nets that covered the entire planet, and she had placed sharpshooters on every building, and she had prepared for war. The mining colony was built into the side of a mountain, and the main command center was a fortress with walls 3 meters thick, and the only entrance was through a security checkpoint, with 20 guards and scanning equipment that could detect a single molecule of explosive material. And Kayla sat in the throne room at the heart of the fortress, and waited. Jake Miller received word of Kayla's presence on Vertex Prime, and he knew immediately that it was a trap, but he did not care because he had been hunting her for months and she had always been one step ahead, and now she was offering herself as bait, and he would take it because his entire purpose was to make her pay for what she had done to Earth. He stole a small stealth ship from a rebel base and flew to Vertex Prime, and he landed in the wilderness far from the colony, and he approached on foot, and his enhanced body did not tire even after walking for hours through snow and ice. And when he reached the outer perimeter of the sensor net, he simply walked through it because the precursor technology in his cells made him invisible to their scans. The guards at the checkpoint saw nothing, and their sensors detected nothing, and Jake passed within meters of them, and they never knew he was there. And he entered the fortress and moved through the corridors like a shadow, and soldiers passed him without seeing, and he left a trail of unconscious guards behind him as he made his way deeper into the complex. Princess Kayla felt something change in the air, and Ash and Ember suddenly raised their heads and their eyes went wide, and they smelled something that should not be there. And they could not see it or hear it, but they knew a predator had entered their territory, and they began to growl. Kayla stood and drew her blade, and she said, "He is here," and sound the alarm. The fortress erupted into chaos, and soldiers ran through the corridors searching for an enemy they could not find. And Jake moved between them and struck from behind, and he used his enhanced strength to break weapons and shatter armor, and he moved so fast that by the time the soldiers turned to face him, he was already gone. Ember launched into the air and flew through the wide corridors and breathed fire that turned metal red hot. But Jake was not where she expected, and he had already moved to another section of the fortress, and Ash joined his sister, and together they hunted, but their prey was always one step ahead. Jake reached the throne room, and the massive doors were guarded by 50 soldiers in full battle armor, and he studied them for a moment, and then he walked straight toward them, and they raised their weapons, but they could not target what they could not see, and Jake moved through them like wind through grass, and by the time they realized something was wrong, 20 of them were already down. The doors opened, and Jake stepped through and saw Princess Kayla standing in the center of the room, and Ash and Ember were circling above, and the dragons had grown massive in the 3 years since he had seen them, and their wingspan was 30 meters, and their scales gleamed like polished stone, and fire dripped from their jaws. Kayla smiled, and it was a cold expression, and she said, "I knew you would come, Jake Miller, and I knew you were alive, and I could feel it in my bones that you had not died in that shaft." Jake became visible, and the precursor technology in his body responded to his will, and his form materialized from nothing, and his skin glowed with blue light, and the scars on his chest pulsed with energy. And he said, "You should have made sure I was dead, Kayla, and now you will pay for what you did to my world." Kayla raised her blade and said, "I do not make the same mistake twice, and this time I will burn your body until nothing remains." She charged and her speed was incredible and her blade moved in patterns that would have killed any normal opponent. But Jake was not normal anymore and he moved faster and he caught her blade with his bare hand, and the star metal should have cut through flesh and bone. But the precursor technology made his skin harder than diamond, and the blade stopped. Dead Kayla's eyes went wide with shock and she pulled back and struck again and Jake dodged and countered, and his fist hit her armor with force that sent her flying backward, and she crashed into a pillar and the stone cracked under the impact. And she tasted blood, ash, and ember dove and attacked together, and flames filled the throne room, and the temperature rose to levels that would have killed an unprotected human. But Jake ran through the fire and it did not burn him, and he leaped and caught Ember by the wing and pulled her down and slammed her into the floor with enough force to crack the marble, and the dragon roared in pain and fury. Ash struck from behind, and his claws raked across Jake's back and drew blood, but the wounds closed almost immediately. And Jake spun and grabbed the dragon by the throat, and Ash was 3 tons of muscle and scale. But Jake lifted him like he weighed nothing, and threw him across the room, and Ash hit the wall, and collapsed. Kayla watched in horror as her bonded dragons who had never lost a fight were defeated by this human who should have been dead. And she felt their pain through the bond, and it fueled her rage, and she attacked again with everything she had. The fight raged for 2 hours, and they destroyed half the throne room, and soldiers tried to intervene. But Jake and Kayla moved too fast, and the soldiers could not keep up, and they were forced to retreat and watch as their princess fought for her life against an enemy who seemed unstoppable. Kayla's armor was dented and torn, and she had wounds across her arms and legs, and her movements were slowing, and Jake was relentless, and he pressed his advantage, and every strike hit harder than the last, and finally, he caught her blade and twisted it from her grip, and it clattered across the floor. He grabbed her by the throat and lifted her off her feet, and his eyes blazed with blue light, and he said, "You killed me, Kayla, and you took my world, and you enslaved my people. And now you will answer for those crimes." Kayla struggled, but she could not break his grip, and her vision was starting to darken, and she could see Ash and Ember trying to rise, but they were too injured to help, and she realized she was going to die, and she felt fear for the second time in her life. Jake looked into her eyes, and he saw the fear there, and he remembered the moment when she had run him through with her blade, and he remembered falling into the darkness and drowning in the ice. And he remembered the rage that had sustained him through 3 years of war, and he was ready to end it. But then he saw something else in her eyes, and he saw the same look he had seen in the mirror when he had first realized what he had become, and it was the look of someone who had been broken and remade. And he understood that killing her now would make him no different than she had been. He released her throat and stepped back, and Kayla fell to her knees and gasped for air. And she looked up at him with confusion and said, "Why, and why did you not kill me?" Jake said, "Because I am not like you, and I will not kill someone who cannot fight back, and your empire ends today. Kayla, and your conquest stops here, and you will spend the rest of your life watching everything you built crumble." He turned and walked toward the door, and Kayla called after him and said, "What makes you think I will stop? And what makes you think I will honor the word of a human?" Jake stopped and looked back and said, "Because if you continue, I will return, and next time I will not show mercy, and I have become something you cannot fight, and I have become the weapon that your empire created when you invaded Earth, and I am proof that humanity will never surrender and never stop fighting, and you can kill us and enslave us, but you cannot break us. And eventually we will win because we have something you do not have." Kayla said, "What is that?" Jake said, "We have nothing left to lose." Earth celebrated its liberation with festivities that lasted for weeks, and people danced in the streets of every city, and the resistance leaders were hailed as heroes, and humanity rebuilt what had been destroyed, and they did it with a determination that came from surviving 3 years of occupation and slavery. Jake Miller did not join the celebrations, and he watched from the shadows as his people rejoiced, and he was happy for them, but he did not feel like he belonged anymore, and the precursor technology in his body had changed him in ways that went beyond physical enhancement, and he could feel himself becoming less human with each passing day. Lisa Chang found him standing alone on the observation deck of the Resistance headquarters, and she said, "Jake, everyone is asking for you, and they want to thank you, and you are the hero who saved us all." Jake shook his head and said, "I am not a hero, Lisa, and I am just someone who was in the right place at the right time, and the real heroes are the people who never stopped fighting even when hope seemed lost. Lisa sat down beside him and said, "What will you do now? And the war is over and you can finally rest." Jake looked at her and said, "The war is not over and the Elvari still control 17 systems and those worlds are still enslaved and someone needs to help them." Lisa said, "You cannot free the entire galaxy. Jake and you are one person, and even with your abilities there is only so much you can do." Jake said, "Maybe, but I have to try, and I was given these abilities for a reason and I cannot waste them." He left Earth 3 days later in a small ship, loaded with supplies and weapons, and he set course for the nearest Elvari-occupied system, and it was a world called Tau Ceti IV, and the native species was a peaceful race of amphibians who had been conquered 50 years earlier. The journey took 2 months, and Jake used the time to plan his approach, and he studied everything he could find about Tau Ceti IV and its people, and he learned that they had once been artists and philosophers, and their civilization had created beautiful works that celebrated life and harmony, and all of that had been destroyed when the Elvari arrived. He landed secretly on one of the moons and made contact with the local resistance, and they were skeptical at first because humans were unknown to them, and they had no reason to trust an alien. But Jake proved himself by destroying an Elvari patrol base single-handedly, and after that they welcomed him, the leader of the Tau Ceti resistance was named Kalara, and she was old by her species standards, and she had been fighting the Elvari for 30 years, and she had seen countless friends die, and her hope had dimmed to almost nothing. But when she saw what Jake could do, her hope rekindled. She said, "You are like the legends and the old stories spoke of warriors who could not be stopped, and warriors who were blessed by the ancient ones, and I never believed those stories until now." Jake said, "I am not blessed, and I am just someone who got lucky, and I want to help your people win their freedom." Kalara said, "The Elvari have 5,000 soldiers on our world, and they have weapons that can destroy cities, and they have dragons, and how can we fight against that?" Jake said, "The same way my people fought, and one battle at a time, and one victory at a time, and eventually they will realize that holding your world costs more than it is worth." He began his campaign on Tau Ceti IV, and he used the same tactics that had worked on Earth, and he struck at supply lines and communication hubs and command centers, and he moved like a ghost, and the Elvari could not track him and could not stop him. The native resistance grew bolder, and they began launching their own attacks, and coordinated with Jake's strikes, and the Elvari forces found themselves under siege from an enemy they could not see, and the occupation began to crumble. Princess Kayla heard about the attacks on Tau Ceti IV, and she knew immediately that Jake Miller was responsible, and she felt a mixture of emotions that she could not untangle, and part of her was angry that he had not honored their unspoken truce, and part of her was impressed that he was continuing the fight, and part of her was something else entirely that she did not want to examine. She called Commander Vex and said, "Send reinforcements to Tau Ceti IV, and we cannot allow it to fall." Vex said, "Princess, we are already stretched thin, and if we send more forces to Tau Ceti, we will have to pull them from other systems." Kayla said, "Then pull them, and Tau Ceti IV cannot fall, and if it does, others will follow, and our empire will collapse." But reinforcements arrived too late, and by the time the Elvari fleet reached Tau Ceti IV, the planet was already in full rebellion, and Jake had destroyed most of their military infrastructure, and the remaining forces surrendered without a fight. The Elvari withdrew, and Tau Ceti IV was free, and Jake stayed long enough to help them establish a new government, and then he moved on to the next system, and the pattern repeated over the next 2 years. Jake liberated 6 more worlds, and each victory inspired others, and resistance movement spread like wildfire across Elvari space, and Emperor Theron ordered his military to stop Jake Miller at any cost, but no one could catch him, and no one could match him. Princess Kayla watched from afar as her father's empire began to collapse, and she felt no satisfaction in being proven right, and she had warned Theron that conquest would create enemies stronger than anything they had faced before, and Jake Miller was the proof. She received a summons to return to the homeworld, and her father wanted to speak with her personally, and she knew what he would say, but she went anyway because he was still her emperor and her father, and she could not refuse the throne room on her. Elvara was massive and ancient, and it had stood for 10,000 years, and countless emperors had sat on the star throne and made decisions that shaped the galaxy and emperor. Theron sat there now, and he looked older than Kayla remembered, and the weight of losing systems was etched into his face. He said, "Daughter, you have failed me, and you were supposed to be my greatest commander, and instead you have become weak." Kayla knelt before him and said, "Father, I have not become weak. And I have become wise, and there is a difference. Theron stood and his voice was cold. And he said, you stopped your campaign because one human defeated you, and you have allowed our empire to crumble, and worlds that we held for decades are now free and all because you lost your nerve. Kayla raised her head and met her father's eyes, and she said, I stopped because I saw the truth, and we create our own enemies, Father, and every world we conquer becomes a wound that will not heal, and eventually those wounds will kill us. Theron said, you speak like a coward. Kayla stood, and she was not afraid, and she said, I speak like someone who has fought Jake Miller, and you have not, Father, and if you had, you would understand, and he is what we made, and he is proof that some species cannot be broken, and humanity will never surrender, and if we continue this war, we will lose. Theron raised his hand, and for a moment Kayla thought he would strike her, but instead he turned away and said, you are dismissed, and return to your ship, and I will find someone else to finish what you started. Kayla left the throne room and returned to the Crimson Dawn, and Ash and Ember greeted her, and they could feel her sadness through the bond, and they wrapped their wings around her, and she told them that everything was changing and she did not know what would come. Next, 3 months later, Emperor Theron announced a new campaign, and he would personally lead the fleet, and they would hunt down Jake Miller and end the rebellion once and for all, and he gathered 50,000 soldiers and 100 warships, and he set course for the system where Jake was last seen. Jake received word of the Emperor's approach, and he knew this would be the final battle, and he could not run forever, and eventually he would have to face the full might of the Elvari Empire, and he was not sure he could win, but he would try because that was all he had ever done. He chose his ground carefully, and it was a system with a young star and several rocky planets, and there was an asteroid field that would provide cover, and he positioned himself and waited. The Elvari fleet arrived, and Emperor Theron broadcast a message, and his voice echoed across all channels, and he said, Jake Miller, you have destroyed what took us centuries to build, and now you will pay for your crimes and surrender, and I will give you a quick death. Jake responded, and his voice was calm, and he said, I will never surrender, and you can kill me, but others will take my place, and humanity will never stop fighting, and neither will the Tau, Sadians, or any of the other species you have enslaved, and your empire is built on suffering, and it will fall. Theron ordered the attack, and the fleet moved forward, and Jake activated the traps he had prepared, and asteroids that had been hollowed out and filled with explosives detonated, and the Elvari ships were caught in the blasts, and dozens were destroyed in seconds. The battle raged for hours, and Jake moved through the asteroid field and struck from unexpected angles, and he used the precursor technology to hack into Elvari systems and turn their weapons against them, and ships collided and exploded, and the void was filled with debris. Emperor Theron watched from his flagship, and he was furious, and he ordered his personal guard to find Jake and kill him, and 100 elite warriors deployed in small attack craft, and they hunted through the asteroids. Jake faced them one by one, and his enhanced abilities made him faster and stronger and deadlier than any of them, and he moved through their ranks like death itself, and they fell before him, and within an hour all 100 were dead. Jake stood in the ruined throne room of Emperor Theron's flagship, and the decision weighed on him like a mountain, and killing Theron would be easy, and it would be justified, and the Emperor had caused so much suffering and death, and Jake had every right to end him. But Kayla was right, and murder would not bring peace, and it would only create more hatred and more war. He stepped back from the Emperor and said, if I let him live, he will just continue his conquest, and nothing will change. Kayla knelt beside her father and checked his wounds, and she said, things have already changed, Jake, and you changed them, and 7 worlds are free because of you, and the Empire is weaker than it has been in centuries, and my father knows he cannot win this war. Emperor Theron coughed, and blood stained his lips, and he looked at Jake with eyes that burned with rage, and he said, I will never surrender to a human, and I would rather die. Kayla said, Father, your pride will destroy everything, and our empire is crumbling, and our people are dying, and you must accept that the old ways are over. Theron tried to sit up, but pain stopped him, and he said, I am the Emperor, and I do not take orders from my daughter or from defeated enemies. Jake said, you are not in a position to give orders either, and your fleet is destroyed, and your elite guard is dead, and you are alone and injured, and you will make peace. Or I will leave you here, and let your own people decide your fate. Theron glared at him but said nothing, because he knew it was true, and his power had been built on strength and military success. And now that both were gone, he had nothing left. Kayla said, Father, I will speak for the Empire if you will not. And she looked at Jake and said, what terms do you want? Jake thought carefully and said all occupied worlds must be freed and all enslaved. Populations must be released, and the Elvari Empire will withdraw to its original borders, and there will be no more conquest, and any world that wishes to remain part of the Empire may do so, but only by choice and not by force. Kayla nodded and said those terms are acceptable, and I will see that they are honored. Theron said you have no authority to make such promises. Kayla stood, and her voice was steel, and she said, Then give me the authority, Father, and name me your heir, and let me end this war and save what remains of our empire, or refuse and watch everything burn. The Emperor looked at his daughter and saw that she was serious, and he realized that she had become stronger than him, and not through military victory but through wisdom. And he felt pride mixed with bitterness. And finally he said, Very well, and you are my heir, and the empire is yours. And do what you must. Jake helped them both to their feet, and together they walked to the bridge of the flagship, and Kayla sent out a message to all remaining Elvari forces, and she ordered them to cease fire and withdraw, and she announced that she was now the acting ruler of the empire and that peace negotiations would begin immediately. The Elvari soldiers hesitated because they had never heard of a war ending this way, but they were tired, and they had seen too many friends die, and they obeyed the order, and the shooting stopped, and the silence that followed felt strange after so much violence. Over the following weeks, Kayla worked with leaders from the freed worlds and with human representatives, and together they drafted a treaty that would reshape the galaxy. And it took time, and there were arguments and disagreements, but slowly they made progress. Jake attended the negotiations, but he mostly stayed quiet and let others do the talking, and he realized that his role as a warrior was over, and that peace required different skills and different strengths, and he was not sure he had those, but he would learn. Lisa Chang arrived from Earth to represent humanity, and when she saw Jake, she embraced him and said, You did it, and you actually did it, and I never thought we would see this day. Jake said we all did it, and I just pushed hard enough to make them stop, and the real work begins now, and we have to build something that will last. The treaty was signed 3 months later, and it was called the Vertex Accords after the planet where Jake and Kayla had first fought their final battle, and it established new borders and new rules for interaction between species, and it created a council where disputes could be resolved peacefully. Princess Kayla became Empress Kayla, and her first act was to formally apologize to all the worlds her empire had conquered, and she promised that the Elvari would help rebuild what they had destroyed. And she meant it. And she began programs to provide aid and resources to the freed world's Emperor. Theron was allowed to retire to the homeworld, and he lived out his remaining years in isolation and bitterness. And he never forgave his daughter for choosing peace over glory, but he also never tried to stop her, and eventually he died, and few mourned him. Jake became an ambassador, traveling between worlds and helping to maintain the fragile peace, and he discovered that he was good at it because people trusted him and they knew he had no personal agenda, and he only wanted to prevent future wars. He and Kayla met regularly to discuss implementation of the treaty, and at first their meetings were formal and professional, but over time, something changed, and they began to talk about other things, and they shared stories about their lives and their worlds, and slowly a friendship formed that neither of them had expected. One day Kayla asked Jake why he had spared her on Vertex Prime, and she said, You had every reason to kill me, and I would have killed you if our positions were reversed. Jake said, I spared you because killing you would have made me like you, and I mean like the person you were before, and I did not want to become someone who solved problems with violence, and I had already become a weapon, and I did not want to become a monster too. Kayla was quiet for a long time, and then she said, You saw something in me that I did not see in myself, and you saw that I could change, and I am grateful for that. Jake said, People can always change, and the question is whether they want to. Years passed, and the Vertex Accords held, and there were problems and conflicts, but they were resolved through negotiation instead of war, and new alliances formed, and trade routes opened, and the galaxy became more connected than it had ever been. Ash and Ember grew old, and their fire dimmed, and eventually they died peacefully in their sleep, and Kayla mourned them deeply because they had been with her for over a century, and they had been her closest companions, and when they were gone she felt an emptiness that nothing could fill. Jake attended the funeral ceremony, and he stood beside Kayla and said, I am sorry, and I know what they meant to you. Kayla said they were more than pets and they were part of my soul, and I will never bond with dragons again because I could not bear to lose them a second time. The precursor technology in Jake's body began to change again, and he noticed that he was not aging, and his body remained the same as it had been the day he emerged from the ancient gate, and he realized that he might live for centuries or even longer, and the thought was both wonderful and terrifying. He spoke with Kayla about it, and she said, "My people live for thousands of years, and immortality is both a blessing and a curse, and you will watch everyone you love grow old and die, and you will carry those losses forever." Jake said, "Then I will make sure the time I have with them matters." Kayla said, "That is all anyone can do." 30 years after the signing of the Vertex Accords, Jake and Kayla stood together on an observation platform overlooking the new capital of the Galactic Council, and it was a space station built by multiple species working together, and it was a symbol of what could be achieved through cooperation instead of conquest. Jake said, "When I was drowning in that shaft, I never imagined this, and I thought I would die, and I thought my world would be enslaved forever. And instead, look at what we built." Kayla said, "We built it because you refused to stay dead and you refused to accept defeat, and you taught me that strength is not about how many battles you win, and it is about what you do after the fighting stops." Jake looked at her and said, "What will you do now, and the empire is stable and the peace is holding and you could retire and rest?" Kayla smiled, and it was a genuine smile without the coldness that had once defined her, and she said, "I will continue working, and there are still worlds that need help, and there are still people who suffer, and I will use what remains of my life to make things better." Jake said, "Then I will continue too, and we started this together, and we might as well finish it together." They stood in comfortable silence and watched the ships come and go, and they represented dozens of species and countless worlds, and they were all here because two enemies had chosen to become allies and had chosen to build instead of destroy. The galaxy was not perfect, and there were still problems and conflicts and injustices, but it was better than it had been, and it would continue to improve because people like Jake and Kayla were willing to work for it. Jake thought about the ancient gate that had changed him, and he wondered if the precursors had known what would happen, and if they had planned for someone like him to find their technology, and he would never know the answer. But he was grateful regardless. Kayla thought about the young princess she had been, and how certain she had been that strength and conquest were the only things that mattered, and how wrong she had been, and she was grateful to Jake for showing her a different path, even though it had come at the cost of everything she thought she knew.